On a cold morning in New Orleans, struggling with multiple jobs to raise her children alone, a poor black woman was nearly drained of all her strength. But when she came across a homeless man being ignored and ridiculed by passers-by, she didn't hesitate to share her last $5 in a meal. What she didn't know was that this small act had led her to an incredible opportunity. The man she was helping wasn't an ordinary beggar. He was a billionaire in disguise, testing the kindness of strangers. Monica Harris, a black woman, walked through it all, but she was not a part of it. She was a visitor in a world that did not belong to her, a silhouette moving between those who refused to acknowledge her presence. Her feet ached from standing for hours at the cafe, her arms sore from scrubbing office floors, but she pushed forward. Isaiah needed his medicine, the bills needed to be paid, and there was no room in her life for exhaustion. She tightened her grip around the thin plastic grocery bag in her hand, fingers curling around its fragile handles as though holding on to something far greater than just bread and milk. And then she saw him. The man sat slumped against the tall, iron-wrought gates of a mansion so large it could have housed an entire neighborhood. His figure was small against the grandeur of the estate, swallowed by the opulence towering behind him. He wore a ragged jacket, the fabric threadbare, his jeans stained and torn at the knees. His shoes, if they could still be called that, were falling apart, the soles barely hanging on, the laces long gone. Beside him, a piece of battered cardboard leaned against the gate, its jagged edges curling with age. The words scrawled across it in shaky, uneven strokes read, "I need help." Monica slowed to a stop. She had seen homeless people before. She had seen men and women tucked away in forgotten alleyways, their backs hunched against the cold, their eyes cast downward to avoid the looks of passing strangers. She knew how the world treated them. She had felt it herself in the wary glances, in the subtle shifts of body language when people saw her standing in the grocery store line, counting change. But this was different. This was worse. She wasn't the only one who had noticed him. A well-dressed man in a navy blue suit walked by, his polished leather shoes clicking against the pavement. He barely spared the beggar a glance before sneering in disgust, his expression twisting as though the very sight of the man had left a bad taste in his mouth. He scoffed under his breath, muttering, "Disgusting. Get a damn job," before walking away. Monica felt her stomach tighten. A couple in their 50s, a woman in a pearl necklace, and a man whose tie was knotted too tight around his neck, paused a few feet away. They stared, but not with pity. "They're everywhere now," the woman said, clicking her tongue against her teeth. "Ever since they started letting them sleep near the quarter," her husband replied. "You give them a dime, and suddenly they think they belong here." Monica's nails dug into her palm. Then came the worst of it. A young man, early 20s, blonde hair, expensive sneakers, earbuds tucked in his ears, walked by with his phone in hand, barely looking up until his foot accidentally nudged the homeless man's outstretched leg. Ugh, what the hell? The young man jumped back as though he had just stepped in filth, his face contorting in irritation. "Seriously, man? Move the hell out of the way." The homeless man flinched, but he didn't say a word. He only shrank further into himself, pulling his arms tighter around his thin frame, as if trying to disappear. The young man let out a dramatic sigh and shook his head. Then, as if to prove a point, he pulled a crumpled dollar bill from his pocket and tossed it at the man's feet. "Here, buy yourself a clue," he sneered before walking off. Monica felt something burn hot in her chest. She wanted to speak. Wanted to yell at them, to make them see him, really see him, the way she did. But she had learned long ago that the people who looked down on others didn't change just because someone told them to. Instead, she moved. She didn't hesitate, didn't think twice. She walked toward the man while the rest of the world walked away. She knelt beside him, the concrete cold beneath her knees, her coat brushing against the pavement. His shoulders were hunched, his head bowed, and when he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, she saw it: exhaustion, despair, defeat. "Have you eaten?" she asked, her voice soft, careful. The man blinked, as if he wasn't sure if she was real. His lips, dry and cracked, parted slightly before he shook his head. "I know, not today." Monica nodded, already reaching into her grocery bag. She pulled out the loaf of bread, pressing it into his hands before fishing out the last $5 bill from her coat pocket. "It's not much," she admitted, "but if you're hungry you can come to my place. I don't have a lot, but what I have I share." The man's fingers tightened around the bread, but his gaze remained locked on her. There was something in his expression, something like disbelief, like he was trying to understand why. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Maybe," Monica replied, "but someone has to." And for the first time that day, the man smiled. The man sat motionless for a long moment, staring at the loaf of bread in his hands, as if it were something foreign, something he hadn't expected to receive. His fingers, rough and calloused from years of hardship, trembled slightly as they gripped the crinkling plastic. He swallowed, his throat working hard against the dryness, against whatever words he was trying to force out but couldn't. The world had hardened him, beaten him down until he had stopped expecting kindness. Until now. Monica shifted slightly on the cold pavement, her knees pressing into the concrete. The weight of exhaustion still clung to her, but at that moment it was something else that held her still, the quiet, almost sacred moment of someone who had been invisible for too long being seen. She didn't know why she stayed. Maybe it was the way his shoulders sagged beneath the weight of whatever he carried. Maybe it was the way his eyes, deep, tired eyes that looked like they had seen too much, stared at the bread, as if it wasn't just food but something far more valuable. Or maybe it was the fact that she had been there before, in different ways, in different places, knowing the feeling of being ignored, being dismissed, being reduced to nothing but a burden. Finally, he let out a slow, shaky breath. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. It was hoarse, strained, like someone who had gone too long without speaking, or maybe just someone who had forgotten what gratitude felt like on his tongue. Monica nodded, shifting her weight slightly. "It's just bread," she said, though deep down, she knew it wasn't just bread. The man shook his head slightly, still looking at the offering in his hands. "No," he said after a pause, "it's not." Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. A gust of wind blew down the street, ruffling the loose strands of hair that had escaped her hood. The city continued moving around them, oblivious. People walked past, too absorbed in their own worlds to notice what was happening on the sidewalk. A couple glanced over but quickly looked away, unwilling to involve themselves in something they didn't understand, something they didn't want to understand. Monica watched the man for a moment longer before finally speaking again. "What's your name?" He hesitated. She could see the moment where he considered lying, giving her a fake name, something easy to forget. But after a pause, he exhaled slowly, as if surrendering something unseen. "Grant," he said finally. Monica nodded. "I'm Monica." Grant studied her for a second, his gaze steady in a way that made her feel almost uncomfortable, not because it was intrusive but because it was rare someone truly looking at her, truly acknowledging her. She glanced down at his hands, at the bread he still hadn't opened, and something in her chest ached. "Have you been out here long?" A humorless chuckle escaped him, the sound rough like gravel. "Long enough," he muttered. That answer wasn't good enough. She wanted to ask more, wanted to know how he had ended up here, what had happened, if there was anyone who still thought about him, still cared if he lived or died. But she had learned long ago that some questions carried too much weight, some wounds were too deep to be opened by a stranger on the sidewalk. So instead, she asked the question that had been lingering at the back of her mind since she first saw him. "Why do people treat you like that?" Grant didn't react at first. He simply sat there, the bread finally resting in his lap, his fingers running absently over the ridges of the plastic. Then he exhaled a slow, tired breath, his shoulders sinking further. "Because it's easy," he said finally. "Because when they see someone like me, they see a problem, a nuisance. Something they'd rather step around than deal with." Monica's jaw tightened. She knew he wasn't wrong. He let out a low, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I watch them, you know. These people walking past. The way they look at me, like I'm nothing. Like I deserve to be here. As if I must have done something to end up like this. And maybe that makes them feel better. Maybe that makes them feel safer." Monica knew exactly what he meant. People needed reasons for why others suffered. It was easier that way to believe that someone deserved their suffering, that they had brought it upon themselves. It made the world less frightening, made them feel like as long as they did everything right, they would never end up like him. Grant shook his head again, his expression unreadable. "They don't see me as a person," he murmured. "Just another thing to ignore." Monica's fingers curled tighter around her coat sleeve. She should have been used to this by now. The world was cruel. She knew that better than most. But that didn't make it right. "You're wrong," she said after a pause. Grant glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. Monica met his gaze, unwavering. "I see you." And she did. Not just a man in tattered clothes, not just a beggar on the street, but a person. A man with a story. A man who once had a name that carried weight, who had dreams before life took them away. Grant held her gaze for a long moment, something flickering behind his eyes, something uncertain, something almost hopeful, though he didn't seem ready to believe it yet. Monica glanced at the plastic bag in her lap, then back at him. "Are you going to eat that or just stare at it all day?" The corner of his mouth lifted in the smallest of smirks. It wasn't much, but it was something. Finally, Grant tore open the bread, breaking off a piece and bringing it to his mouth. Monica exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The world continued to move around them. Cars passed, people walked by, conversations hummed in the background, but for just a moment, in the middle of it all, there was stillness. And for the first time in a long time, Grant wasn't invisible. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying the distant hum of city life, the rhythmic honking of impatient drivers, the muffled laughter of pedestrians wrapped in scarves and thick coats, the occasional clatter of a delivery truck bouncing over uneven pavement. But here on this cold stretch of sidewalk, between towering mansions and iron gates, there was only stillness. Monica shifted slightly, hugging her arms around herself for warmth. The cold was creeping in, seeping through her coat, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too full. Grant had barely touched the $5 bill she'd given him. He held it in his palm, his thumb absently running over its worn edges, as if the weight of it was heavier than it should have been. He didn't pocket it. He just sat there, staring at it like it was something foreign, something he wasn't sure belonged to him. Monica let out a slow breath, watching it cloud in the crisp morning air. "I get it, you know," she said finally. Grant looked up at her, his dark eyes searching, cautious. "Get what?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "Being stuck." Grant studied her for a moment before glancing away. He leaned back against the iron gate, exhaling deeply. "Yeah?" Monica nodded, gripping the sleeves of her coat a little tighter. "My husband died 2 years ago. Heart attack. No warning, no signs. One minute he was there, and the next he wasn't." She swallowed hard, staring down at her lap. "I thought we'd have more time." "We always think we have more time." Grant was quiet. Monica let out a bitter chuckle, shaking her head. "We weren't rich, but we got by. He worked construction. I worked whatever job I could find. After he died, it all just collapsed. There was no backup plan. No safety net. Just me, trying to hold everything together." She exhaled sharply, as if saying it aloud made it heavier. "I've got 2 kids. One of them, Isaiah, he's 6. He just got admitted to the hospital this week. Pneumonia. Bad enough that they want to keep him there, but," she trailed off, her voice growing tight, "they won't if I can't pay." Grant turned his gaze toward her, the sharpness in his eyes softening. Monica forced a weak smile. 3 jobs. That's what it takes to keep a roof over our heads, food on the table. And even that's not enough." Grant exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "And people think poverty is a choice." Monica laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, they love that one." The wind blew again, rattling the iron gates behind them. Monica could feel the weight of Grant's stare, as if he was seeing something in her that she had tried so hard to keep hidden. "You still keep going," he said finally. Monica glanced at him. "What else am I supposed to do?" Grant tilted his head slightly, considering her. Then he let out a small breath and sat up straighter, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking off something unseen. His fingers tightened around the $5 bill before he slowly folded it and slipped it into his pocket. "I have money," he said. Monica blinked, confused. She let out a short, dry chuckle. What? Grant exhaled, as if bracing himself. He looked at her then, fully, his dark eyes steady, unblinking. I'm not homeless, he said. Not really. Monica's stomach tightened. Grant straightened, his hands resting on his knees. My name is Grant Kensington, he said, his voice even deliberate. I own one of the largest private investment firms in this city. He gestured toward the mansion behind them, the very one they were sitting in front of. This house, it's mine. Silence. For a moment, Monica could do nothing but stare. The words didn't make sense. She let out a breathless laugh. You're joking. Grant didn't smile. I'm not. Monica's pulse pounded in her ears. She looked at him again, really looked at him. And suddenly, the details that had seemed out of place before began to align: the way his voice carried authority even in softness, the way his posture had a certain quiet confidence, the way he had spoken about the world with the kind of knowing that only came from someone who had been on both sides of it. She shook her head. No. This doesn't make sense. Grant reached into the tattered jacket he was wearing and pulled something out: a sleek, black leather wallet. He flipped it open, and inside, neatly tucked in one of the compartments, was an ID. Grant Kensington, CEO. Monica's stomach dropped. She looked up at him again, her mind racing, trying to piece it all together, to make sense of the absurdity of it. Why? She breathed. Why the hell are you sitting out here like this? Grant's expression remained calm, but there was something in his eyes, something deeper, something raw. I wanted to see, he said. I wanted to know what it felt like, to be ignored, to be looked at like you don't belong. He let out a slow breath. I wanted to know how many people would walk by. Monica couldn't find her voice. She thought about the people she had watched earlier, the sneers, the disgust, the indifference. She had seen it all before, but never like this. Never so plainly, so undeniably. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. And what? She asked, her voice quieter now, sharper. You're playing some kind of social experiment? Seeing how the other side lives? Grant shook his head. No, he said. I'm trying to understand. Monica exhaled, shaking her head, still trying to process it all. And what did you learn? Grant held her gaze. That people like you are rare. Monica swallowed hard. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, too big to grasp all at once. She had given him her last $5. She had given him food. Not knowing, not expecting anything in return. And now he was looking at her like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find. Monica looked away, her throat tight. So what now? Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Now, I help you. She snapped her gaze back to him. Grant pulled his wallet out again, but this time he didn't just flash his ID. He pulled out a sleek, black credit card and held it out to her. This will cover Isaiah's medical bills, he said. Every last cent. Monica's breath caught. She stared at the card, at the sheer impossibility of it. You don't even know me. Grant smiled a real smile, warm and sure. You didn't know me either, he said, but you still gave me everything you had. Monica felt something crack in her chest, something that had been held together by sheer will for so long. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the edge of the card. And for the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a distant thing. It felt real. Monica's fingers trembled as they hovered over the sleek black card, her pulse a rapid, uneven rhythm in her ears. The weight of everything pressed down on her, at once: Isaiah's fragile body hooked up to machines, the hospital bills stacking higher than she could ever climb, the suffocating exhaustion of working 3 jobs just to scrape by. And now, here it was, the solution to everything, held between the fingers of a man who, just minutes ago, had been another forgotten figure on the street. Her breath was shallow. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Grant didn't waver. He sat there, his gaze steady, calm but firm, as if he had already decided this was happening and was just waiting for her to catch up. You don't have to do this, Monica whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Grant exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. Yes, I do. His voice was quiet but certain, as if the realization had settled into him just as deeply as it had settled into her. Because I can, and because you deserve it. The world felt too still, as if the air had been sucked out of it, as if time had stopped and left only the two of them sitting on that cold pavement between two vastly different lives. Monica's hands curled into fists on her lap, her nails pressing into her palms. Her entire life she had fought. She had struggled, endured, carried weight that no one should have to carry alone. And she had never asked for help, because help had never come. But now it had. And she didn't know how to take it. Grant must have seen it, must have understood the battle happening inside her, because his voice softened. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "This isn't charity. It's balance." Monica blinked at him, confused. Grant leaned back against the gate, running a hand over his tired face. "You gave me something today," he said. "Not just food. Not just a few dollars. You saw me. When everyone else walked by, you stopped. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just a statistic. I wasn't just something for people to step over. I was a person again." His words hit something deep inside her, something raw and unspoken. Monica's throat tightened. She had spent years feeling invisible, moving through the world as if she were nothing more than a machine built to work and survive, a nameless worker cleaning floors, waiting tables, counting crumpled bills in dimly lit apartments while the rest of the city thrived around her. She had never expected kindness, not real kindness. And now, here it was, staring her in the face, daring her to take it. She swallowed, her voice unsteady. "What if I can't pay you back?" Grant smiled, a small, tired thing, but genuine. "Then don't." He shrugged. "Or do. In whatever way you can. Help someone else. Change someone's life the way you just changed mine." He exhaled, glancing down at his hands. "You already did more for me than you realize." Monica let out a shaky breath, her fingers finally closing around the card, pressing it against her palm as if testing its reality. It was real. This was real. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. She met Grant's gaze, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that this was a mistake, that he would regret this the second she walked away. But there was nothing. Just quiet certainty. She nodded once, sharp and quick, like a decision being made in real time. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Grant's expression softened, as if he had been waiting for that moment. Monica stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting on the cold pavement, her body still processing the weight of what had just happened. She clutched the card in her hand, tightening her fingers around it, as if it might disappear. Grant rose too, brushing dust from his worn-out jeans, his tattered disguise now feeling strange, out of place. He was still in it, but he no longer looked the part. Not to her. Monica hesitated, shifting on her feet, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to make sense of this, how to thank someone for changing your life in a matter of minutes. So she just said, "You sure about this?" Grant let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as he shoved his hands into the pockets of his ragged jacket. "No," he admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." Monica exhaled sharply through her nose, something like a laugh escaping before she could stop it. It was the first time she had laughed in weeks. She nodded, adjusting the strap of her grocery bag on her shoulder. Then, after a pause, she extended her hand. Grant glanced at it, then took it without hesitation. His grip was warm, solid. A handshake that meant something. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady this time. Grant gave a small nod. "Don't waste it." Monica squeezed his hand once before pulling away, turning on her heel and walking away from the mansion, from the cold pavement, from the version of herself that had come here believing that no one in this world cared. She didn't look back. Because for the first time in a long time, she had something to walk toward. The air was warm, carrying the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the distant laughter of children playing in the park. Monica walked with ease now, her steps no longer burdened by exhaustion, no longer dictated by the weight of endless shifts and unpaid bills. Life was different, better. A year had passed, and in that time, she had found something she never thought she would again: stability. With Grant's help, she had secured a steady job, not one of survival, but one where she was valued, where she could breathe. She had moved her boys into a safer neighborhood, a home with space, with warmth, with a future. Isaiah was healthy, running again, laughing again. And for the first time in years, she didn't have to wake up dreading the day ahead. And now, standing outside the quiet corner cafe where they had agreed to meet, she saw him again. Grant was waiting at a small table by the window, no longer in the tattered clothes of that cold morning, no longer carrying the weight of his experiment. He looked like himself now, a man in control, composed, but somehow lighter than before. When he spotted her, he stood, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. "You look good," he said as she approached. Monica smirked, settling into the chair across from him. "You look richer." Grant laughed, shaking his head. "I guess some things don't change." A comfortable silence settled between them before he exhaled and leaned forward slightly, his expression turning thoughtful. "I owe you a lesson, you know. You taught me something I didn't expect to learn." Monica raised an eyebrow, waiting. His smile softened. "That sometimes the people who have the least give the most." Monica studied him for a moment, then nodded, her own smile growing. "And I learned something too," she said. "That kindness always finds its way back, sometimes in the most unexpected ways." Grant lifted his coffee cup in a silent toast. Monica mirrored the gesture. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.